Hello and welcome everyone to the Sensory Analysis Laboratory. This is the heart of the activity related to sensory analysis and consumer science. Sensory analysis and consumer science is a field related to studying perception of consumers and, generically speaking, people. We have a lot of different methodologies related to how to detect and describe food. Some tests have to do with the detection of personal judgment, the so-called hedonic tests, but sensory analysis envisages also other type of tests called discriminative tests or descriptive tests. During the lessons of sensory analysis, we teach students to learn when and how to adapt and apply these methodologies. The Sensory Analysis Laboratory was born as a structure built to control some variables in the environment that may affect the perception, so the tasting. That's why we normally acquire data in individual booths like this one, in which we have a computer which is connected with the central server, in which we can set up different type of tasting. The variables that we normally control during tasting are, for example, the amount of sample served, the temperature, but also the noise. So we try to conduct tasting in an environment without noise. And in some case, we can also try to modulate or exclude variables related to the appearance. That's why in some case, if we want to specifically study just one sensory modality like the odor, instead of the appearance, we may use colored light that mask the appearance, as we know that the appearance strongly affect our expectation, our liking, and so the overall final perception. So samples are normally served in blind conditions, so without specifying the brand, and typically are served with random 3-digit codes that do not influence the assessor in terms of quality, so without giving an evaluation 1, 2, 3 or A, B, C. That's the typical way we codify samples. The sequence of serving is randomized and balanced across assessor in order to minimize effects, bias related to the order of serving. And now that we did this short introduction, we will show you some examples of relevant sensory tests that are, can be adapted in sensory analysis and consumer science. In a frame of interactive didactic, it is important to highlight the fact that these methodologies of the sensory analysis and consumer science can be adapted to conduct streaming lessons or remote tasting. In particular, in streaming lessons, the lesson can be arranged with equipment in each booth, filming, streaming live what is going on in the sensory analysis laboratory. While in case of remote tasting, the teacher can organize lessons with the pre, during and post lesson so that the student can autonomously, under the guidance of the lecturer, conduct at home remotely, live, the tasting. This second option requires, of course, a suited preparation before. In particular, before the lesson, the student must equip him or herself with samples to taste, but is absolutely feasible. In fact, for didactic purposes, it is not essential that the samples that a student is tasting at home is identical to the ones tasted by other colleagues, since it is important rather the methodologies rather than the samples. while if we are conducting tasting for research purpose, in this case it is essential to have and to send remotely the same samples to taste. In this case, prepared boxes are sent to the taster, to the assessor, before the tasting. So this require quite a bit, it's a quite a bit complex organization that is conducted in research purposes. In general, in these activities that requires that students are not in person, so both remote tasting and streaming lessons, in general, I was saying it is extremely important that the lecturer, the teacher, stresses the methodology of tasting. For example, that he indicates to students the procedure to taste, observing the sample, smell, taste, put attention in evaluating the texture. So the procedure of tasting is indeed one element that must be stressed by the lecturer. In general, the possibility of set up digital classes, as the one we have shown, increase highly the valence of the didactic activity and give the possibility to students that cannot attend in-person lessons to still have a high value degree of teaching, and also to set up more interactive teaching activities.
The first test that we will see belongs to the category of discriminative test, and this is the triangle test, in which we ask to the taster to check and to try and to taste 3 different samples, but that are made just by 2 different products, and they have to find out which are the different ones and which are the similar one. So in this case, we have the instruction for the taster, in which we ask to just find out the one that is different. And in this case, we have apple juice, and the difference of the apple juice are just the technology that are used to prepare it, and from 2 different kind of brand of apple juice. And the taster have to taste the product following an order. As you can see, there are 3 samples with 3 different random codes, and the taster have to try and to taste it and check which are the different ones. The triangle test can be used with consumers to assess perceptive differences between 2 products, or with trained assessors to evaluate the degree of training among panelists. A way to confirm the result is to repeat the test several times with a large number of tasters. The results of the triangular test are made by the sum of the correct answer to the test, and then also comparing the number of correct answers with the accepted risk with specific table that reveals the minimum number of responses needed to say that there are significant differences. Affective tests are typically done with consumers to assess a personal response of liking or acceptance about different products or prototypes, or just about different characteristics of a product. For this test is identified a specific target consumers. To the taster are presented the different sample monadically, so just one by one, to avoid the comparison between the different products. And for each sample, generally is asked to the consumer a personal judgment for the liking, using a precise kind of scale. For example, the hedonic scale that go from 1 to 9. So the 1 that is the extremely dislike, and the 9 that is the extremely like. With this test, is not just asked to the taster to measure the liking, but also to evaluate their interest or availability in purchasing, also giving other information as food habits, personality traits, or socio-demographic data. In this case, on identifying the preference among 6 different chocolate samples, is used an hedonic test with a liking scale. After data collection, the mean value are computed, and after that is typically applied univariated analysis of variance, ANOVA, to assess whether the liking across samples statistically differ. descriptive tests are the ones that are typically done with trained taster, because we want to research on finding out a technical definition of a product, and also to define the sensory profile, defining all the attributes related to a product. One of the most important descriptive tests that we will see is the quantitative descriptive analysis, QDA. In the QDA, we need a group of trained tasters, and to train the taster, we generally go through two different phases. The first one is in group, in which we train the taster, find out a common vocabulary with which we build up the ranking scale. The second phase is an individual phase. So assessor receive normally from 4 to 10 samples per session served monadically, so one by one, and served under identical condition. The general instruction is to please evaluate each sample according to the specific tasting protocol and rate for each sample the perceived intensity of all sensory attributes which define the sensory profile on the provided scale. The tasting protocol normally envisages the evaluation of the following sensory modalities, so appearance, odor, taste, texture, and flavor. To give an applied example, this type of test could be used to analyze 4 different types of extra virgin olive oils. It definitely needs to refer to a trained panel of 10 to 12 tasters who have trained before with the panel leader to develop the language that will make up the linear rating scales. Data analysis from QDA is complex. It firstly requires the evaluation of the agreement cross-panel and validation of data. Mean values are then used to create graphical output like spider plot or principal component analysis, PCA, to visualize, respectively, sensory profile of oil and the sensory characterization of all the samples.
Okay, so in the previous part we have seen how to arrange a sensory test, which are the principles relevant to setting up a sensory evaluation, and which are overall guidelines to set up consumer tests. Now let's focus a little bit about to what to do before, during and after the test in a perspective both of activity conducted at the sensory analysis laboratory, but also for remote tasting, so in case of distance learning. Let's make an example. We have mentioned a triangle test on juices. How to prepare a triangle test? We need 3 different samples of juices, for example, commercial brands, but as usual in sensory analysis, we do not identify samples with brand, but instead with 3-digit random codes. The fact that codes are anonymous serves in order not to create bias, not to create expectation in assessors. As usual, it is important to standardize the serving condition. What does it mean? It means that the amount of served sample must be the same. For example, let's pour 25 ml for each sample. What does it happen if the amount served is not the same? It means that if I do not measure, the final amount would be different, and so the overall perception of intensity may be diverse. So the overall amount of smell may be diverse. It's what I call intensity stimulus error. So it is important to standardize the served amount of sample thanks to cylinder or thanks to devices like this machine, the scale. Together with the importance of standardizing the amount of sample served, it is also important to standardize the serving temperature, so the temperature at which a sample is served. Why? Because if something is very hot, the release of aroma would be very high. Instead, if a beverage or a food would be very cold, the release of aroma and the overall perception would change. To do that, we often could use instruments like that measure the temperature of a food or a beverage. In some other case, we could work in a sample for which we want to exclude the influence of appearance. For example, if we want to just work on aroma without the impact, the influence of appearance, we could work by masking the appearance of food. So either using standardized mask dark color, like glasses like that, or using vials or other type of containers that help in masking the appearance of food. In case of remote tasting, some pre-prepared kit can be arranged previously of the test and sent at home to students and both teachers. Boxes can contain pre-weighted samples, or in some cases samples that must prepared by students themselves. In some cases also instruction must be delivered. Instruction can be delivered in a shape of evaluating scorecard, like this one, that explain how to conduct the sensory evaluation, for example, evaluating the aroma, the taste, the flavor, and the texture. Or can be more complex scorecard and flavor aroma wheel, like this one, used in case of descriptive tests, in case of longer activity, for example with the panel. In both cases, so both in lab but also in remote condition, it is important that the panel leader, the lecturer, the teacher, guided strictly the evaluation and also highlights the point relevant for the tasting procedure.
The higher programs education on gastronomy usually focus on some courses implying some practical activities. In particular, in our case, many courses of sensory evaluation and consumer science requires students to be taught in learning how to perform sensory tests and how to analyze the data and report the results. For this purpose, it is of course extremely important to have the chance to perform some practical exercises. When this is not possible in presence in a real physical sensory laboratory, it's important to have some digital lessons, video, pre-recorded videos or live streaming lessons. In our previous part of this video, you were informed about the practical considerations that we need to take into account to plan this kind of teaching activities. But I would like to add something based on my experience in digital education. In particular, I would like to focus the attention on three key points that are extremely relevant before the lesson, during the lesson, and after the lesson. Regarding the part before the lesson, it's extremely important. A keyword that I would say it's the efficacy of the teaching activity. We know that when we are in presence, it's much more, it's easier to be involved in the activities. It's easier for students to remember what they are learning, and so in general, in presence, the lesson is more effective than in digital conditions. So it's important to prepare the students before the lesson, to give them information, more materials useful to more focus their attention on what they will do during the practical activity online. So it could be useful to provide some readings and some materials like the evaluation scorecard, some aroma wheels, some vocabulary that can be used to describe the sensory properties. During the class, I would say that the key word is interaction. We know that during a digital lesson it's more difficult to create interaction with students, so I would suggest to plan some individual tests that can be conducted at home or remotely or during a live streaming class, but it's also important to plan some activities in groups. So maybe after doing the sensory test, students can be suggested to collaborate, to share their opinions, their thoughts, their comments on the activity that they performed individually. And third, after the class, I would say that the key word is the accuracy. It's important to provide all the information, the materials needed to develop a report showing the results of the activity. So in particular, when the students are required to collect data and to analyze the data and to report the results in a paper or with a video presentation, they should be aware about the details that are extremely important. So the teachers should provide extra materials that can be used after the practical exercises to learn how to analyze the data. So some tutorials and using the statistical software could be very helpful. Information, very detailed information on which are the content of the different section of the report should be very clear. And it could be also helpful to suggest the students to prepare some video that they can share with their colleagues. So it would be nice to have a sort of exam where students show their results to their colleagues in order to promote the discussion. So in conclusion, these are just practical tips, but I think it's important to be aware of how it's possible to make more effective these digital classes in comparison to the in-person lessons.